Hi, my name is Megan Bever. I am book review editor for the Journal of the Civil War Era. And today I am here with author Jill Newmark. She is an independent historian. She's the former curator and exhibition specialist at the National Library of Medicine with the National Institute of Health. She has curated numerous exhibitions and written several articles on African American medical personnel who served during the Civil War. Today, we are here to talk about her book, Without Concealment, Without Compromise: The Courageous Lives of Civil War Surgeons. Welcome, Dr. Newmark. Could you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in exploring these 14 Black surgeons who served during the Civil War?
Sure. When I was working at the National Library of Medicine, I had been working with a colleague of mine, Margaret Hutto, who on an exhibition called Opening Doors: Contemporary African American Academic Surgeons. And it was about academic surgeons because academic surgeons give back to younger, aspiring Black physicians. And we wanted to kind of go back historically and see about pioneers that were earlier. And that included institutions like Howard University and Meharry that had Black medical colleges. And while doing some research about Howard University, I found out that among the first five um, professors in the medical department was a Black physician named Alexander Augusta. And that I came across and learned that he was a surgeon during the Civil War. And so it piqued my curiosity. And I go, I wonder if there were other Black surgeons during the Civil War. So, of course, it's kind of like a bee in your bonnet, and it just kind of keeps buzzing. And it sort of set me off on a journey about were there other Black surgeons? And then when we came upon the 150th celebration of the Civil War, um, in the exhibition department, somebody said, anybody working on anything like this? And I go, well. And so that kind of um, snowballed into an exhibition on African Americans that served during the Civil War in medical positions. So that's kind of how it happened.
So, in Civil War scholarship, biography is experiencing like a bit of a renaissance among historians. And your study fits into this category. So what made you decide to examine these men with like a collective biographical approach?
Well, each story is so unique. And it wasn't that easy to actually find writings, letters, papers of these Black Civil War surgeons, because at the time, nobody thought what Black people were doing was important to save anything. But through my research, I found small little things, articles in newspapers, letters in the National Archives, things like that. And so as I began to see their words and how they describe things, I wanted to tell their story through their own words as much as possible. And the best way to do that is through a biography. Um, and I didn't feel like I had to interpret their words because if you look at some of the things they say it and it's pretty clear and the intent is clear. And so I always like to tell the stories of people through their own voices. And the biography, worked that way. And when I was talking with my publisher, I had originally was going to split it into two because there were, 13, 14 of them. And they said, no, we want you to do all of them in one book. And so that's how the collective biography came about. And it's the interesting thing about the way the book is organized. It is a biography, but there are some that have very little information that you can find and some that have a lot. So with some that have smaller amount, I had to find other ways of talking about their lives and find a different lens to talk about. So either it was through their education, like the last chapter just deals with Iowa because four of them went to one school. So that's kind of how that came about.
I think I think the approach works really well. Like it's a joy to read, and the men really just come alive in the chapters, the way that the book is structured.
Thanks.
And when I was reading it, I was struck by their upbringings, which are and their lives as young adults. And they're not altogether similar, but you've got men who have lived abroad. You have some who are somewhat associated with Black immigration, either to Liberia or the
Mm.
Caribbean. And as you said, you have several who end up in Iowa. Um, can you speak a little bit about how mobility played into their opportunities to become physicians, and also how it might have contributed to their ability to serve during the war?
Yeah, I think geographic mobility was really important. Um, the thing that makes a lot of these men similar is that they came from families that were diverse. William Powell had a Black father and a Native American mother, or they had, using terms from that period of time, either their parents were mixed race, mulatto or octoroon or something. So they came from mixed families. They also came from what would have considered um, well off. They had funds. And in order for you to have geographic mobility, you have to have the means to do it. You also have to be fairly educated. So their parents were fairly educated as well. So I think it aided them in many ways. They were able to get educations and medical degrees when a lot of people didn't. You know, William Powell Jr. got his degree in England. Um, John Van Serly de Grasse, whose father was a landowner, went to Paris and got an education. Um, Anderson Abbott, who was Canadian, and Alexander Augusta went to Canada. Now, some of these men could not get into medical schools in the United States, so therefore they had to go elsewhere. But I think it gave them geographic mobility, gave them diversity. They were exposed to a lot of other kinds of things. They were able to get medical degrees. And a Black physician that wanted to become a Civil War surgeon or be in the war really had to have a medical degree from a university because it was different. The, the standards were different and they didn't really accept Black physicians. So I think it was really key um, to a lot of these men's stories. And some of them actually, like John Rapier Jr., traveled prior to becoming a physician in the, in order to find a better place to live with more opportunities for Black people. But they had the means to be able to do that. So,
And then in addition, like if we move beyond their upbringing, their early lives, their ability to be mobile and to get an education, um, what do you think when these men start serving in the war, what do you think are some of the key experiences of wartime service that they share?
well, as Black surgeons, they were limited to where they could serve. When Alexander Augusta became the first African American medical officer in the Army, he was commissioned. There was only one other man that was commissioned, that was John Van Serly de Grasse. After that, they were all contract surgeons because contract surgeons were easier to get rid of. And there was a lot of controversy with having a Black surgeon because they faced a lot of discrimination. When Alexander Augusta went to muster in with his regiment, the Seventh, there were, I think, two or three other Black regiments there, but the surgeons were white and they did not want to serve beside and alongside Black surgeons or be their subordinates because Augusta was the senior surgeon. So this created a conflict, and Alexander Augusta ended up being moved um, to a post to examine Black recruits. So they're similar. They had similar experiences in that they could not serve with regiments. More than half, about half, a little bit more than half, actually served at Contraband Hospital in Washington, D.C. So that was a central place because it was a hospital that treated Black patients, both soldiers and civilians. So they had very similar experiences in being discriminated against, of being mistreated. Um, John DeGrasse got cashiered out on what I believe are false charges of drunkenness and insubordination. That was an easy way to get rid of him. Alexander Augusta was moved to examine recruits, and the rest worked in hospitals. So, um, you know, that was their experience.
And you point out too that it was amazing. Maybe it shouldn't be because of the other work that's been done on Civil War veterans. It was shocking to me how many of them die fairly young, from illnesses in the post-war years, and then just the discrimination and their inability to get pensions. The few that
Yes,
try,
yes.
that seem to continue as well. But yeah, I think your study and the explanation of a contract surgeon and the way that these men are just constantly coming up against barriers is really enlightening.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, when they applied, when Alexander Augusta first applied, they had to go and get a signature, and the guy at the desk thought he was the surgeon's driver, and he said, "No, I am the surgeon." Or Augusta got thrown off of a streetcar because he didn't want to stand in the rain, and he couldn't, and they wouldn't allow him to sit. So there was a lots of that kind of stuff going on, that clearly was discriminatory, and they did the best that they could
mhm.
under those circumstances.
Yeah. So this is maybe an unfair question, because it may be asking you to like choose between your children, but which of these men's stories did you find particularly fascinating and or challenging to interpret?
Yeah, that's an easy question for me.
Oh, okay.
um, when you do a biography and you research people for so long, they sort of become your family.
Yeah.
um, but one of my favorites is John Rapier Jr. And I think one of the things that makes him stand out is that there are an enormous amount of letters that he wrote to his family members, and family members wrote to him. Because Moreland Spingarn at Howard University has the Rapier Thomas letters. Rapier's brother was in Congress. His uncle owned a lot of land. So somebody preserved these, and they're fascinating. And what they tell is you get a feeling about what their life was like and what they were feeling and what their opinions are. So that was just fascinating because he was very precocious as a child. He was very much committed to his family and trying to find a better life. He was enamored by women, and had there's this section in one of his letters where he talks about all these communications between these women and their protestations of love, and just he was very poetic, and it just gives you a really good insight into him. So I really enjoyed that. He did die young, but he lived a really full life because he went to Jamaica and Haiti. He became a dentist. Then he went to the university, and he had a very interesting experience at the University of Michigan because when he wrote and said, "I came from Jamaica," they looked upon him as a man of color that was foreign. There was another black man named Alpheus Tucker who was born in Detroit that was there, and he was asked to leave the school, but Rapier was not. So, there's another connection to geographic
Mm-hmm.
locations and how that can influence. The one other story that I'll mention is Richard Green. He was in the Navy, but from all the research I've done, I think that I always say it's either benign neglect or intentional, covering up the fact that he was a black man. Um, because he would never have been able to serve in the Navy or treat white naval personnel on a ship. So that story was a little bit more complicated to tell because you don't know whether he was intentionally covering up his race, whether they just didn't, whether they were ignoring it because they needed surgeons, or they just didn't know. And so it brings up a lot of different things about that experience for him and what that meant and represented and why it happened that way. So it was a little bit more complicated story to tell, I think.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the book with us?
Um, it's really it was a fascinating journey to research and write the book. And when you do biographies, the story never really ends because you still find more information. But if you will allow me this, I always read this last passage from my book when I end a talk. And I think it's an important part because it ties in their story with the present. So I'll read this. It says the impact of these Black surgeons made and their contributions during the war can be felt today. In 2019, the University of Michigan paid homage to one of these surgeons, Alpheus Tucker, by establishing a professorship in his honor. Dr. Theodore Washnew, who was the first Alpheus W. Tucker, MD, collegiate professor of internal medicine, he explained to me that naming the professorship after Tucker recognized, quote, the university's history of racism and the faculty's complicitness in that racism. Naming a professorship in his honor seemed to me, he said, to be a way to apologize for that wrong and commit to doing better in the future. It's meant to remind us that our institution, as all institutions, is imperfect and that constant efforts to live up to our democratic ideals are necessary. Progress does not happen by some invisible force. It happens when people make the effort to fight for justice. And I think all of these surgeons did that in some way. And in their own way, they made progress and fought for justice and equality through their work and their service as surgeons during the
Mhm.
war.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think that's an important reminder. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today
Yeah.
about your book, Without Concealment, Without Compromise. Um, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
All right.